From the campus of Yale University, this is Business Talk with Jim Campbell, nationally syndicated across the country on the Biz Talk radio network and coming to you from our flagship stations, Yale Radio WYBC and 1490 AM WGCH Greenwich. All talk and all business, 60 minutes of radio with leading figures from the world of business along with the business of politics and sports. Murder in Greenwich, home of our flagship station. A murder that's captivated a nation over 40 years. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. puts his reputation on the line for his cousin, Michael Skakel, proclaiming his innocence, charging he was framed, claiming he can ID the real killers. The Martha Moxley murder, today on Business Talk with Jim Campbell. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., a New York Times best-selling author, one of the nation's leading environmental analysts, activists. He's president of the Waterkeeper Alliance, the world's largest clean water advocacy group, a professor of environmental litigation at Pace University here in White Plains, senior attorney at the Natural Resources Defense Council, former assistant DA in Manhattan, of course, a member of America's most prominent political family's got a controversial book that's just out, Framed, Why Michael Skakel Spent Over a Decade in Prison for a Murder he didn't commit. Thanks, Bobby, and thanks for being in studio with us, too.
Thanks for having me, Jim.
By the way, just to remind folks, Martha Moxley was murdered in 1975 on Halloween Eve. Michael Skakel was convicted of that. He served 11 and a half years before a habeas corpus appeal let him out for incompetent legal representation by Mickey Sherman, also a Greenwich resident. Let me ask you first, because this is what folks have asked me. Prominent family, leading environmentalist. Why are you risking your reputation? Why are you doing this?
Well, I wrote the book because the same reason that I wrote the article, my Atlantic Monthly article in 2003, because I knew Michael Skakel was innocent. I know he's innocent. Oddly, my relationship with Michael Skakel over the past, since 2003, since before I wrote that article, has been largely estranged. In fact, I didn't reconcile with him until January of this year. So, but I knew he was innocent, and I watched this the whole trial happen, and it was like watching a slow motion train wreck, and I saw. I didn't know about the corruption that I found while investigating this book. I didn't know about a lot of the details, but I could tell. I knew from watching it that he was being railroaded.
Okay, Bobby. The title is Framed, and ironically, Michael was never a suspect until he put himself at the scene of the crime in the Sutton Report, which, for those that don't know, was a private investigation group hired by Michael's father to look into this thing, to hopefully exonerate them. And he would never have been a suspect if he hadn't put himself there.
Yeah, Michael is, that's right. But he was telling the truth. So, and he told, Michael doesn't have a good filter. He's not a strategic thinker. Whatever comes into his head, he talks about. And he was by the time the Sutton Report came out, he'd been sober for a decade. He's scrupulously honest. And when they asked him what had really happened that night, he gave a different story than he told police in 1975, but it was not a new story. He'd been telling that story ever since he got sober in 1982. All
right. Now, I got to commend you on this. First of all, obviously great loyalty. The book is incredibly detailed. And so for my looking at this, I said, well, I'm going to go look at some of the stuff that you used and that's out there, the Sutton Report, which we just talked about what that is, the Furman book. I looked at Martha's diary a little bit, the YouTube that you recommended on Tony Bryant, and the Atlantic Monthly article that you wrote, and then obviously Framed. First off, on the Atlantic Monthly article, that was obviously focused on Kenneth Littleton, who was the tutor, extensively. In your book here, he has almost a bulletproof alibi with Tommy Skakel. The sexual encounter ended at 9:50 between Martha and Tommy. He then watched the French Connection either at 10 or 10:17 he arrived. That means that Littleton had that little window to go out, pick up a golf club, and rage kill someone he didn't know because he had just moved in that night. What about the sort of the changes in even your approach?
Well, when I wrote the Atlantic Monthly article in 2003, I was very careful about saying I don't know that Kenny Littleton committed this crime, but I know that the evidence against him was far stronger than any evidence against Michael Skakel. Michael Skakel could not have committed the crime. He was 11 miles away with 5 eyewitnesses when the crime was committed. There were 8 eyewitnesses that remained at home at Belhaven who either saw him left or saw him leave, saw him come back, and all of them have testified through the years that he was not at the house at that time. Kenny Littleton, on the other hand, had 5 separate alibis. Every time he talked to police, his alibis changed dramatically. He failed lie detector tests on multiple occasions. He was linked by police to 20 other serial killings, mainly of young blonde girls Martha's age in Canada and the United States and different places where he'd lived. And he was in and out of prisons and mental hospitals, and he made several statements that appeared to be confessions to the crime. So there was a very strong case against him. I don't believe that Kenny Littleton committed the crime. And I said at the time that I didn't know because I don't think the evidence was sufficient. I think it pointed to him in many ways, and he was by far the strongest suspect. And he was the primary suspect of the police who were investigating this for 25 years.
I want to talk about that alibi, about going to the backcountry a little bit later. To me, I looked at a framework too. Could you establish reasonable doubt legally? And I think that's not actually, honestly, very hard to do, going beyond Tommy Skakel. And why is it that you don't list him as a logical suspect?
Oh, well, I do in this book.
But he's not anywhere near your killer, in terms of priorities and how you list them out.
Well, each one of the suspects I devote a chapter to, and Tommy has the longest chapter. Tommy Skakel didn't commit this crime. His alibi is I would say it's ironclad. It's not. Michael's is the strongest alibi, but Jonathan Benedict, who's the prosecutor in this case, and Detective Frank Garr, who had a great antipathy, hates the Skakels, and spent a lot of his career trying to link the Skakels to this crime, but even he says that Tommy Skakel could not possibly have committed this crime. And the reason he gives is the same reason that you described for Kenny Littleton, that he's a 17-year-old kid. He would have had to murder Martha. The murder took place at 10 o'clock at night. And Tommy, 20 minutes later, was watching The French Connection.
He also has no motive.
He has no motive, exactly. But, whoever committed this crime was covered with blood. He was wearing the same clothes that he wore at dinner. And that fact is attested to by Kenny Littleton, who was the principal suspect, and it would have a great incentive to inculpate Tommy.
I agree.
On the other hand, Tommy really doesn't alibi Kenny Littleton, because Tommy says that when they were watching The French Connection, Kenny Littleton kept himself draped in a blanket the whole time, and that blanket could have been used. And it was odd because it was hot, it was warm inside the room.
It's just hard to conceive that.
It's hard to conceive.
He moves in, he doesn't even know her. But
yeah, exactly.
Let me ask you on the Sutton report. They identify a profile of the killer. That profile fits Michael the best, 14 to 18, walking distance of the victim, same socioeconomic, strong sibling rivalries, behavioral problems in school, sexually immature, which you say in the book, by the way, under the influence of alcohol. And they describe Michael as severely agitated, possibly of psychotic proportions. He had a very abusive background. I happen to, Tommy Reynolds is great friends with my parents. Ann Reynolds Skakel was the mother. When she died, the family basically fell apart. I feel bad for Michael in that sense. But the Sutton report basically profile and fit. He's the best fit from there.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a number of problems with that theory. One is that Michael couldn't have committed the crime because he was 11 miles away with all the eyewitnesses. The prosecutor, nobody's ever been able to explain how he could have committed this crime from 11 miles away.
If he went to the backcountry.
If he went to the backcountry, and if he didn't go to the backcountry, and why then why did nobody see him the entire night?
Well, hypothetically, Bob,
you would have had you need 15 people essentially to be lying to say that he didn't go to the backcountry, including people who have no relationship to the Skakel family. The other thing is that the Sutton report is not reliable because, as I show in the book, and this is one of the things we discovered in writing the book, is that Tommy Sheridan, who was an insider in the Skakel family, who dreamed up the Sutton report, then subtly manipulated the contents of the Sutton report to implicate Michael. So it was the whole exercise of the Sutton report was deliberately orchestrated in order to falsely implicate Michael. So
Sheridan comes off very badly in your book, although he says that Michael didn't do it.
He says that but if you read, he was saying to people's faces that Michael didn't do it, but he was saying behind the Skakel's backs, hey, you should keep looking at Michael. And
all right, you're listening to Biz Talk Radio Network. Biz Talk with Jim Campbell over the Biz Talk Radio Network, 350 stations around the country. We'll ask Bobby Kennedy who he's uncovered next. And we're back talking with Bobby Kennedy about his belief his cousin Michael Skakel was framed for the murder of Martha Moxley in 1975. The ending is, I think, incredibly powerful, put together. Who done it?
Well, let me talk to you about how I kind of stumbled onto this story. I wrote in 2003 when Michael was convicted. It shocked the Skakel family, and it shocked me personally. Nobody believed that he would ever be convicted of this. And I wrote an article for the Atlantic Monthly that detailed how Michael could not have committed the crime. The article won a number of prizes, but in addition to that, I received a note shortly after its publication from a man I'd never heard of called Crawford Mills, who was a classmate of Michael Skakel's at Brunswick School in Greenwich. Crawford Mills opened with a provocative line. He said the jury got it wrong, and then he outlined this extraordinary story that he knew who actually killed Martha Moxley, and that a person who had informed him of this was another classmate, Tony Bryant. Tony Bryant is a member of a very prominent African-American family in New York. His cousin is Kobe Bryant, the Lakers star. His brother played in the NBA also for the Mavericks. His mother is an Oscar-winning film producer. He was part of an integration push at Brunswick School in 1973 and 1974, along with one other African-American student. He was a star athlete. He was not a friend of Michael Skakel's. In 1975, in his junior year, he moved back to New York to be with his mother, and he enrolled in a public school in New York called the Charles Evan Hughes High School. While in that fall, he befriended two boys who committed the crime. The boys, he knew the boys as Adolf and Burr. They were large kids. They were a year older than their classmates. They were 6'3", 6'3", and 6'4", respectively. Each of them weighed around 250 pounds, and they were both very powerful athletes who were capable of committing a crime that required the kind of savagery that Martha Moxley's murder entailed. Tony brought them up to Greenwich on about 6 occasions to hang out with his old pals in Greenwich. on one of those occasions, the two boys met Martha Moxley, and this is recorded in her diary that she was at Tony brought them to a Sacred Heart mixer in Greenwich to a dance, and Martha describes that evening also in her diary. And Adolf Hasbrook, one of the two boys, became obsessed with Martha at that dance, and for the next 2 months could talk about nothing else except for his fixation for Martha. On Halloween Eve, they came back to Greenwich to participate in Hell Night or Mischief Night, which was a big celebration in Greenwich where kids wanted the town committing acts of vandalism. They went up. They arrived. They planned the sexual assault on the train on the way up, the two boys. They told Tony that they were going to get a Greenwich girl caveman style, which meant, according to Tony, hit her over the head with a club, drag her into the bushes by her hair, and then sexually assault her. When they got to Greenwich, they wandered around throwing eggs, throwing rocks at cars, soaping people's windows, hiding behind bushes, hiding behind stone walls to avoid detection. It was a cold night. It was very dark. They eventually ended up at 8:45 that evening on the Skakels' back lawn on the chipping tee that Rush Skakel maintained, Michael's father maintained for his house guests and for his family. They picked up 3 golf clubs on the chipping tee, 3 Skakel golf clubs that were strewn there from a Mitsubishi chipping tournament that Rush Skakel had hosted a few weeks before. The two boys told Tony, now we have our caveman clubs, and Tony got nervous and threw his club away and went home, made his way back to the Greenwich train station 20 minutes before the murder was committed. The two boys then watched Tommy Skakel making out with Martha on the back of the tool shed, which was visible to them, but they were not visible because of the ambient light from the house. They could be seen. Tommy and Martha could be seen, but the boys could not be seen from an area that is known as the Mead, where kids hid. They assaulted Martha Moxley on her way home, and then hid out that night in the home of an 11-year-old boy called Jeffrey Byrne, who was a mutual friend of Crawford Mills and Tony Bryan and Michael Skakel, and who was a neighbor of Michael Skakel's. The following Monday, that was a Thursday night, the following Monday, Tony met them for the first time again at school, and they confessed to him that they had gotten their caveman, that they had, in other words, committed the murder. And over the next 2 months, they added many details that made it very clear that they had killed Martha Moxley. In addition to that, Jeffrey Byrne, the 11-year-old boy, made many trips down to New York City from Greenwich by himself on the train because he was so traumatized by what had happened that night. And he was angry at Tony for getting him involved with these boys, and he warned Tony, they're bad. You need to stay away from them. Tony confessed, told his mother what had happened. His mother recognized the racial landscapes of this time. It was 1975, and that Greenwich police were notoriously racist. That Tony had placed himself a few feet from the murder scene with a golf club in his hands 20 minutes before the murder, that he was black, and she warned him that he could be implicated in this crime if he confessed, and that he had brought the murderers to Greenwich. She said he had to keep his mouth shut and that he had to separate himself from his two friends. He did that. She sent him away to Texas to boarding school to get him out of New York City, away from these kids, and he didn't talk about it for almost 3 decades. When I finally reached him on the phone, I said to him, I'm Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Michael Skakel's my cousin. I'd like to ask you about Martha Moxley's murder. And there was dead silence on the end of the line, and then he said, after about 5 seconds, he said, I've been waiting 27 years for this phone call.
All right, we'll talk about this and other alibis. We'll look at some of the evidence with Bobby Kennedy on the Martha Moxley murder. Coming up next. And we're back talking with Bobby Kennedy about his belief his cousin Michael Skakel was framed for the murder of Martha Moxley in 1975. All right, we were talking about Tony Bryant and his claims and who you think were the real killers. And you got a few more comments you want to finish up with?
Well, my initial reaction to Tony Bryant was that I believed his account, but I needed to verify it. And to whether these guys, he only knew the first names of the two men he said killed Martha Moxley, which was Adolf and Burr. I was able to track down a yearbook from the Charles Evan Hughes High School and determined that Adolf was Adolf Hasbrook of Bridgeport, Connecticut, that Burr was Burton Tinsley of Portland, Oregon. I called both of them and had conversations and tape recorded those conversations. And they admitted that they, all of the important particulars, of course, they didn't admit to killing Martha Moxley, but they admitted knowing Tony Bryant, knowing Crawford Mills, hanging out in Greenwich with Tony Bryant. They admitted knowing Jeffrey Byrne and the house that they spent the night and cleaned off the blood. Afterwards, they described the interior of that house with details that nobody else could have known, right down to the brand of the refrigerator in Jeffrey Byrne's kitchen. They then, after some time, after several conversations, they began dissembling and then later denied that they had been at Greenwich that night. They both said they had looked at their diaries from 28 years before and that they had been mistaken and were not in Greenwich that night after all. And then when we subpoenaed them, they took the Fifth Amendment. But I found in my investigation mountains of corroborative evidence to support Tony's stories, including the fact that there were two hairs that were taken off of Martha's body or from the blanket on which she was placed, and one of those hairs was identified by the FBI crime lab as being negroid, and nobody has ever been able to explain that. The other hair was described as being having Asian characteristics, and Tony Bryant describes Burton Tinsley as Caucasian, but with American Indian blood or Asian blood, so that would be consistent with that description. There's a lot of other corroborative evidence as well that's in the book.
Okay, Bobby. I did watch, per your recommendation, the book that Vito Colucci interrogating Tony Bryant. He comes off looking very articulate and sincere. But no one saw these two guys that night. Helen Nix didn't see him. He says in the tape that Margie Walker, who was, I guess, Neil Walker's sister who lived next door, saw him, that he talked to them. She didn't even go out that night. Another person named Lisa Rada Edwards said she didn't go out that night. And so, and I've been in Belhaven, as I was telling you, these folks, like black folk would have really stuck out back then. The security guards on the booth actually come to recognize. Used to drop my daughter every day. They would wave. No one saw the guy. And in the 2007 attempt at the retrial, why has it never been considered credible enough to be entered as evidence anywhere?
Well, here's the answer. Those are two questions. The first question is that the question of whether they were there that night. And, the best evidence that they were is that Tony Bryant, who is also African-American, says he was there, and it's definitely not in his interest to admit that he was there. Both of the men, Adolf and Burr, both acknowledged on tape that they were there that night, and that they were there many times in the past. One of the issues with this book is that people's memories 30 years later are incomplete. You said that Margie Walker says she wasn't out that night, but Burton and Tinsley and Tony said that they dropped by her house and that she wasn't out that night.
Right, but wouldn't she have said she saw them then?
Well, if she remembered, but the memories of that night are incomplete, and everybody says, well, a black person in Greenwich would have been noticed, but there was a lot of black people in Greenwich that time. People's memory of Belhaven as being lily white just isn't accurate. There were the Skakels, for example, had two African-American teenagers living in their home at that time that were, precisely the age of all these other kids. They had a black live-in housekeeper. There are many other people in Greenwich who had people who were working for them, live-in people who were African-American. The two officers who first arrived on the site were both African-Americans. So they're, the memories that people have, there couldn't have been a black. Tony Bryant was a frequent visitor to Greenwich. He had a girlfriend in Bellhaven. And again, people don't remember that these days. So the memories are of virtually every witness that I was able to interview.
The second question now, just to get going, which was that it hasn't been considered credible.
Well, this case has never been vetted by a jury. It's never, the police never questioned these witnesses. One of the suspects, Adolph Hasbrook's home is only a few blocks from Frank Garr's office in Bridgeport, and yet Frank Garr has never bothered to go down and interview Adolph Hasbrook. Now, what the state will say now is, well, they've taken the fifth, they refuse to talk to us, but the state has it in its power to give them immunity and force them to talk. So, and Tony Bryant has indicated that that's what he wants to do. He wants to tell the state the truth about this crime, but they won't give him immunity first, which of course they ought to. So the state, and if the state really believed that Michael Skakel was guilty, then why wouldn't they give immunity to these three men?
But if they do, you're right in that sense. But if they give them immunity and they're the real murderers, they're off.
Right, but and I think that the state recognized that, and that's why they don't want to give them immunity.
All right, let's go back to some of these evidence, because to me, a huge, crucial moment is, did Michael go to the backcountry? Because that gives him an alibi. And there is evidence that he did not. And one of the things that's interesting is Julie Skakel in 1975, which is when this happened, you talk about memory problems, she sees that shadow at 9:30 that you talk about, and then she yells, "Michael, come back here." Finally in the actual trial, as you say, she said she saw at 9:50 then large, dark, bigger figures than her brother running, carrying an object in their left hand. In 75, she said in 1975, she said at 9:50 she saw nothing. Did she change her testimony, or what are you basing that on, the confidence of Julie, who, and by the way, interestingly enough, Andrea Shakespeare, you say that she cited, and she very strongly that Michael didn't win, and you go after her, but you never mentioned Julie had at one time said he didn't go.
I have never read anywhere that Julie said that he didn't go. Andrea Shakespeare says, and Julie says, what Julie has said consistently is she was in the house, that they never saw the Lincoln Leave with the boys in it. Andrea Shakespeare never saw the Lincoln Leave with the boys in it.
So they didn't know if Michael was in the car?
They were essentially in a dead zone in that house. And Andrea Shakespeare, if you read her testimony, she said Michael was never a suspect in this case, so nobody ever asked her about Michael Skakel until 10 or 15 years after the crime was committed. And she said at that time that she never saw Michael Skakel in the house, but that she had a feeling he was there. But she also said she had a feeling about a bunch of other things. For example, that Jeffrey Byrne wasn't there, that were also inaccurate. And, a hunch by a witness 15 years after the crime was committed is not very reliable evidence. And that's the only evidence. And in terms of, Julie saw a figure just before she left the house, Julie and Andrea, dashing in front of the window. It was in a crouched position. She didn't know who it was or whether it was one of her brothers, and she shouted out Michael's name, but she never saw him, and she does not believe that was Michael Skakel.
Okay. I want to talk about the pants now. These pants were seen were recovered from the Skakel garbage, right? And these are the jeans. And that you say, and I've seen a picture of them, the waist does look way too big for Michael, but the length is pretty short. And I guess Michael denied they were his, but it was tracked down that they came from a camper in New Hampshire or something, and Michael did have them. They had some of his stuff in in the pocket. You put them on Hasbrook, I think, right? Or you imply. But your book also says that Michael admitted they were his at one point.
Now, this is a big source of confusion in this case. There were actually two sets of pants and two sets of sneakers. There was a pair of pants that were shown to Helen Hicks by the police, by Carolyn Looney, the night after the murder, were covered with blood, and a pair of I believe they were Keds sneakers. So they were sneakers that the kids in Greenwich were not wearing. The kids in Greenwich were wearing tree-torn sneakers, which were sold at the Bellhaven Club and were regarded as cool by those kids. There was those pants and those sneakers, the size 13 sneakers and the size 36 pants, were lost by police afterwards. They appeared to be soaked in blood. A week after the murder, there was a pair of pants found in the garbage and another pair of tree-torn sneakers. Those did belong to Michael Skakel. He never denied that those were his pants. They had a stain on them that turned out to be a paint stain. He had gotten them from a kid in New Hampshire. Tommy Sheridan told the police, in order to be a provocateur, that Michael had denied owning those pants or ever being at a camp in New Hampshire. Michael Skakel says Tommy Sheridan never talked to him about that and was doing what we showed Tommy Sheridan was doing throughout this book, which was to obfuscate and to tell lies to the police, to cast doubt on Michael Skakel.
And we're talking with Bobby Kennedy about the Moxley murders and his claim that Michael Skakel was framed. We'll talk about that coming right up. And we're back with Bobby Kennedy on his controversial new book, Framed. And we're going to ask him in a sec who did frame Michael Skakel. But I want to get to one more thing that, whether there was a motive or not. And one of the things you say is that it wasn't until 1998 that Michael had any sense that Tommy knew, that he knew Tommy and Martha had anything going on or that they were doing anything. And I have a real hard time finding that to be credible in the sense that there was, Martha's diary says that Michael was crazy about the thing.
About what?
In the car, they were right next to each other. Tommy was trying to feel her up. There's somebody named Liz Arnold from Elan, and I know you do a good job of discrediting Elan, who said that Michael had that Tommy had stolen his girlfriend. If even in the car, if you have teen hormones, would you have said, I'm going to go to the backcountry? You probably would have been pretty jealous. And it's, go ahead.
Well, first of all, Michael never read Martha Moxley's diaries. Michael is dyslexic. He, at that point in his life, he was reading nothing. So, and he didn't know until 1998 that there was anything between Tommy and Michael and Tommy and Martha, even though Tommy had told that story to the Sutton detectives in 1993 or 1994. But Michael was never shown the Sutton report. And nobody talked to any of the Skakels about what was in the Sutton report because Tommy Sheridan wanted to keep the Sutton report secret and away from the Skakels because it illustrated that he was committing treacheries against the Skakels. So none of them saw it. Michael Skakel had an interest. As he said, he would have liked to kiss Martha Moxley, but he had two girlfriends, Jackie Wettenhall and another girl, Francie from Armonk, New York, whose last name I don't want to mention, but those were his girlfriends. He had a childhood crush on basically anybody, but Martha Moxley was his friend. To say that he didn't go to backcountry would mean that there were 5 people who, for 30 years, have been lying, including Dennis Osorio, a well-known psychiatrist and Westchester restaurateur, who saw Michael at watching Monty Python's Flying Circus, the American premiere, in Sursum Corda in the backcountry, who talked to him that night, who had no motive to lie, and also the family members who drove him there, spent the evening with him there, and drove him back at 11:30. There's never been any even an inkling of any credible evidence or testimony that indicates that Michael didn't go to the backcountry, and that was the assumption of the police. That's in the police reports. There's literally 15 eyewitnesses who confirm that in one way or another, and you'd have to have really a massive conspiracy over many, many years that makes no sense.
Yeah, I don't believe in massive conspiracies. I find it hard to believe there's 15. Oh, Sorio also.
Well, there was 8 at Belhaven, 8 people at Belhaven.
Who were those people? Because some of them you said Julie and Andrea were in the house and didn't see who left.
Right. So they didn't. So the 8 people who stayed at home didn't see Michael at the house. Michael would have had to remain hidden for for 3 hours at the house with nobody seeing him. And then several of those people actually saw him get in the car and leave and go to Sursum Corda with his brothers and his cousin. And then there were people at Sursum Corda, George Anteri and Dennis Osorio, who remember him arriving there, watching. They all went over, as you know.
Watch Monty Python, yeah.
Yeah, Rush Skakel, who is his elder brother, who was a Dartmouth senior, had seen a trial audience show of Monty Python's Flying Circus in Dartmouth, and had fallen in love with the show. And it was, at that time it was on the air in England and the BBC, but it wasn't on the air in the United States. So he had gotten a glimpse of it. When they announced that it was going to be on the air in the United States, he assembled his brothers and cousins to go over and watch it at Sursum Corda. And that's where Michael was that night.
All right. I want to talk now. The big surprise is this habeas corpus ruling on appeal that said that he got an incompetent defense, which I always thought had to be a level of you're drunk, you're sleeping, really that kind of incompetence, not the quality of the defense. I asked Mickey Sherman, and his comment he gave me was from 1998 when the case began to 2004 when the verdict came in. Bobby stopped by for one day. Take us through why you think Mickey Sherman blew the case.
Well, that is the vast inventory of incompetence and malfeasance and malpractice by Mickey Sherman is meticulously inventoried in the chapter on that subject in the book and in Judge Bishop's decision. So, Mickey Sherman went to jail after this trial for essentially taking money that he was supposed to spend on the trial and spending it on personal enterprises, and then failing to pay taxes on it. He did basic. I've taught trial practice for 30 years. I was a prosecutor. He violated every. It would have taken. It just took a mighty effort to lose this case. In all of my years of teaching, I don't think I've ever met even a first-year law student who could have lost this case. This was a 30-year-old case where the police lost most of the evidence. They lost the murder weapon, the handle of the golf club. They lost anal swabs, vaginal swabs that could have exculpated Michael. They lost many, many hairs that were found on Martha's body. They lost the pants, the sneakers that were blood covered. They made every mistake that you could possibly make. There were five other culprits who had much better evidence against them, who could have provided a third-party defense. Mickey didn't bother to run down alibi witnesses that could have put Michael, a non-family alibi witness, Dennis Osorio, who he never interviewed. That alone is pro forma malpractice. That alone. He also didn't bother to track down the witnesses who contradicted the two confession witnesses that played the key role against Michael, who said, Greg Coleman said that there was another man present when Michael allegedly confessed to them. Mickey Sherman never bothered to look for that fellow. When we found him, Cliff Grubin, he said absolutely he was there and Michael did not confess. So how can you not bring that witness to court? He didn't prepare the witnesses. Now that's trial practice 101. This is a 30-year-old crime. How can you let a witness, one of your witnesses, the Skakel brothers, go on the stand without showing them the statement that they made in 1975, which corroborated everything that Michael's defense was claiming? He never showed them those statements. These kids didn't remember what they said in 1975 about Michael Skakel. It was insignificant then. He was never a suspect in the case. It wasn't like Michael was a suspect so you would remember. He was never a suspect for 25 years. So, and they had no memory of who was in the car. At that time, there was a contemporaneous recording of what they said, where they said Michael was in the car. He came with us to backcountry. We watched the TV and came back. But they didn't remember that. They didn't remember what they said 30 years ago. And Mickey never bothered to show them their earlier statements before putting them on the stand. There was all of this stuff. Yeah, there are many other things. He never got. There were police in Rochester, New York, who were anxious to come to Greenwich to testify that Greg Coleman was a pathological liar who could not be believed on any account. People who knew Greg Coleman intimately, that was the key witness against Michael. And Mickey never called them. So there were many, many other things that he did.
Did you feel all this while the trial was ongoing that they made a mistake hiring him, and or should he have been fired by Michael or whoever would have had that decision making?
I was estranged from Michael during the trial, so I called Mickey repeatedly to question judgments that I saw on TV or that I heard about. And, he would assure me every time that I talked to him, I know what I'm doing. And, people wonder if he was so incompetent, why didn't the Skakels fire him? But there's a number of answers to that. One is that the Skakel family, Rush Skakel at that time was in the last throes of dementia, the father. Yeah, so Michael was managing his own defense. What he says is, when I get on an airplane, a 747, I just assume the pilot knows what he's doing. And Mickey had, as you know, this kind of boisterous confidence, and he also had a track record. He had actually tried a really difficult murder case, tried it on an extraordinarily imaginative defense, and carried it off. So, you're talking about a dyslexic kid who has had a dysfunctional life and has a highly recommended attorney that he immediately begins having doubts about, but he doesn't have the confidence to, or the knowledge of the law, or the knowledge to understand all of the crazy things that Mickey Sherman is doing. But as you'll see in my book, Michael was constantly badgering him to call witnesses, to correct misstatements by the prosecutor, and Mickey just never did it.
Let me ask you, you mentioned estrangement between you and Michael. Michael's done a lot of good works for the last X number of years. Even the judge had said that when he sentenced him. Why has Michael and Tommy not spoken in 20 years? Is Tommy bitter that he was the suspect out?
Tommy actually would like to reconcile with Michael. So, but Michael, I believe will reconcile with Tommy at some point. Michael, first of all, has been in jail for 11 years. And he had very little contact with the outside world. He only saw his son 8 times. I think that reconciliation has not taken place. Michael has a strong AA program. He's been sober for 35 years. And, one of the things that that program teaches is you can't, you have to reconcile your relationships, and I think he's going to do that.
So he knows that should be on his agenda. How is Michael Skakel doing now, and how is his son doing now?
Michael's life is much smaller than it used to be. He wears a GPS bracelet. He's not allowed to leave the state of Connecticut or now New York without permission from the court. There's many places where he can't go because, for example, he can't go to New York City without permission because there's members of the Moxley family in New York City. So he's technically a free man who has not been tried. He has all the rights of somebody who has not been charged or tried with the case. But in reality, the Connecticut Supreme Court could come down with a decision any day that sends him back to jail for the rest of his life or a 25-year life term. And the best scenario is that they uphold Judge Bishop's decision and that, then he has to face another trial.
Why do you think that this was a circumstantial evidence case, meaning there was no direct evidence, DNA, witness, anything? How do you think a jury came to that unanimous decision?
They came to the decision because of the perjured testimony of two supposedly confession witnesses. The state, as you said, had no evidence against them, so the only way that it could make a case was through a confession. Michael, of course, had never confessed, so they had to concoct them. And what I show in the book for the first time is how Frank Garr, the corrupt Greenwich police detective, suborned the perjury of these witnesses in order to get them to falsify evidence against them. And I now have transcripts of Garr's secret transcripts of his initial discussions with those witnesses, which actually shows him point by point suborning John Higgins' perjury. That the state lucked out because Coleman died, who was a 350-pound junkie, and was not a good witness. He changed his story repeatedly. He would collapse on cross-examination, but he died right before trial, and the state was allowed to use an actor, a very buttoned-down, presentable actor, to stand in for him and recite his testimony, and the jury afterwards said they believed him. There were so many holes that the prosecution did something very odd in this case. It never tried to show how Michael could possibly have committed this crime from 11 miles away. It threw to the jury. It said, we don't know how he did it, but he confessed, therefore he must have done it. And then the prosecutor, John Benedict, went across ethical boundaries to show an audiovisual that was absolutely decisive at the end of this trial.
It appeared to be Michael confessing, right?
That appeared that was cut and paste confession to murder, which Michael never made.
Which he was talking about masturbation in the tree.
He was talking about masturbating in the tree. He was a horny little kid. He did something crazy. It's not murder. But he was talking about his guilt, his panic at having people know that he had done that, his fear of discovery that somebody might have seen him. And those words were pasted and cut by John Benedict and edited selectively to appear on a screen in red splashing letters with gruesome pictures of Martha Moxley's body in the background on the overlay, making it appear to the jury as if Michael was confessing not to masturbating, but to murdering Martha Moxley. And it was that, Jonathan Benedict, until that moment, did not believe that Michael would be convicted. Dominic Dunn, Len Levitt, and nobody who knew Michael believed he could possibly be convicted. But that deceitful video, which the state paid $65,000 for, sealed Michael's fate.
Let me ask you this. Michael has great certainty. You have great certainty.
And by the way, Leslie Stahl, when she saw that video and questioned Benedict about it, she said, if I did that at my television station, I would be fired for deceit. Oh.
Okay. You all have great certainty that he didn't do it, but if you go back in time, Michael has shown periods where he didn't really have a lot of certainty, and I believe if he did it, he would have had to have been in a blacked out rage from drinking and drugs, and also from the rage, so he wouldn't necessarily know that he did it in his heart, because if he was blacked out.
Well, you can say that about anybody. I mean, the fact is that he was 11 miles away with 5 eyewitnesses when the murder was committed. He couldn't have done it.
All right. What's the moral of the story from you put this all together? What's the moral of the story?
This is really two books. It's a book about how Michael was framed by a murder that he did not and could not have committed, and who did the framing. And for the first time, I'm able to put that whole story together in meticulous detail and walk the reader through about how the frame took place, starting with Mark Furman, the disgraced L.A. police detective who played the pivotal role in O.J. Simpson's acquittal, who was the initial mastermind of the essentially the scheme to frame Michael Skakel, and then the secret role of a Skakel family insider, Tom Sheridan, who was working behind the scenes with Furman, with Detective Carr, with Len Levitt, and with Dominic Dunn to provide them phony information about the Skakels, and particularly about Michael.
Sheridan is the guy you believe framed him?
Yes. Tom Sheridan framed him, along with, this other cabal of people who had their own self-interest in convicting Michael. Each one of them had mercenary interest in this project, and Sheridan gave them the ammunition they needed to go forward to convict an innocent man. So that's one story, and it's a story nobody's ever read before. The other story is how the murder was actually committed and how I tracked down the murderers and questioned them and then corroborated their testimony.
And on the celebrity gossip side, you feel that the Kennedy cousin linkage is what made this case and what he was subjected to?
Yeah, even the people who participated in framing him said they couldn't do this unless they had a Kennedy cousin as a suspect, and that's why they chose Michael. The Michael does not have a drop of Kennedy blood. Mark Furman, nevertheless, was able to brand him with a new first name, Kennedy cousin. Michael Skakel the Skakels had. I never knew Michael Skakel until 8 years after this crime was committed. I never heard of the Martha Moxley murder until 8 years after this crime was committed. The first time I ever heard of the Martha Moxley murder was in 1983 when Tommy Skakel visited our home in Hyannisport, Massachusetts for the first time. Nobody in my family had ever met him before. And somebody said to me that he was a suspect in a murder. That's the first I ever heard of it. So none of us... this whole idea that the Kennedy family was orchestrating Michael Skakel's escape from accountability for this murder it's mythology. There was no contact, virtually no contact between the Kennedy and Skakel families, as I show in this book. I have a chapter called The Kennedys and Skakels.
They don't like each other either.
Well, it's not that they don't like each other. My mother loves her brothers, but she was estranged from them. They were oil and coal Republicans. They had their own kind of iconoclastic and approach to life. They supported Richard Nixon during the 1960 election. They supported, against my uncle, they supported Kenneth Keating in his Senate election against my father in 1964. They opposed my father's presidential bid in 1968, and the families were estranged. So, there's no Kennedy cousin who knew any Skakel cousin when we were growing up. None of them had ever met. And the first time I met a Skakel, as I said, was in 1983, which was 8 years after this crime was committed. So Michael never considered himself a Kennedy cousin. He never called himself a Kennedy cousin. Their family had their own a unique gestalt. They were not within the orbit of the Kennedy family. They were probably wealthier than the Kennedys, and they were proud of their heritage. They were friends with Ronald Reagan, and they were part of the petroleum aristocracy of the Republican Party, and they would have considered any kind of connection to the Kennedys as a kind of social demotion.
All right, I want to finish up last question where we started, again, asking, you were estranged, you just went through the whole thing, and yet you have put your reputation, you're going to get beat up on this stuff, as you know. So I want to again let you say exactly why you did it, and also something that's really hard to believe. But there are folks that say this book he was going to write, Dead Man Talking, A Kennedy Cousin Comes Clean, that you wanted to do anything you can to not have that published. So it was a quid pro quo for coming out and defending it. It doesn't really hold water. But just one more chance about why you're doing this.
I'm doing it because I know Michael Skakel's innocent, and that I've never heard that last theory that you just said, but that book, Dead Men Talking, as far as I know, it's all over the internet already. So I have not read it, and except for select parts of it. But Michael Skakel has disavowed it, and it will never be published, no matter whether I publish a book or not. I knew Michael was innocent, and it's like, for me, it's like if you're walking down the street and you see a mugging, and you have to make a decision about whether you're going to go and try to be of help for somebody who's being bullied, or whether you're going to put your head down and keep walking and pretend you didn't see it. And for me, that's not my nature. And, I knew he was innocent. I saw how the whole thing happened, how the whole thing proceeded. And, one of the things that I think it's important for people to understand is I don't think people should listen to my opinion about Michael Skakel's innocence. I don't think it carries any water. I'm his cousin. So it's easy to dismiss. People need to follow the facts of this case, and the facts for the first time are outlined in this book. If you differ with the fact, if you differ with my opinion, it's fine, but you can't differ with the facts. The facts are the facts. And one of the great pitfalls of this case is that nobody was ever looking at the facts. There were 401 reporters certified to cover this case, but the interest in it was a mile wide and a quarter-inch deep. Nobody bothered to live. There was only really one reporter, Leslie Stahl, who was willing to publicly lift up this thin patina of orthodoxy that was part of the public narrative, and really question the facts that supposedly underlay Michael Skakel's guilt.
All right, let me give you one chance to. The Mrs. Moxley never gets closure on this case, and she's reading the book, I'm told, and she's heard about the Crawford Mills thing. He's the guy that you'd said first reported this to you. He ended up committing suicide. She had confronted him on he was working at ABC, I think. What about Mrs. Moxley on that?
Well, on the larger issues, I'm trying to give Mrs. Moxley and the Moxley family closure on this case. By putting the real killers in jail, I sympathize and empathize with Mrs. Moxley. I've had 2 members of my family murdered, and I know the difficulty of you losing people, young people. I have 2 brothers who died at a very young age, before their time or before they reached their potential. So I have great sympathy for her, but it doesn't give closure to the Moxley family by putting an innocent man in jail for the murder of their daughter. It only compounds the tragedy. And I think, ultimately all of us have a duty to look for the truth. And, and there's no justification for putting somebody who's innocent in jail. Mrs. Moxley has repeatedly said that she does not want to look at the evidence of this case. So her opinions about who is guilty and, Michael's guilt come from Mark Furman, which she acknowledges, Detective Garr, Dominic Dunn, and Len Levitt. And those are all people with craven and mercenary agendas who, I think did not do I think they did a great disservice to Mrs. Moxley, although they all claimed to have her interests at heart. I think all of them were pursuing their own interests, and I think I show that clearly in this book.
All right. Well, thanks to Bobby Kennedy Jr. in studio giving us a full hour. The book is framed Why Michael Skakel Spent Over a Decade in Prison for a Murder He Didn't Commit, published by Skyhorse Publishing. Thanks, Charlie Lyons, for making this happen. Our next show, The Rise, Fall, and Comeback of former New Jersey Governor James McGreevey. Thanks to Bobby Kennedy again for giving us a full hour. Thanks to our national audience for listening. We'll see you next Sunday on Business Talk with Jim Campbell.